Amongst the many major points people give about Bleach's Soul Society arc, one less common one is how much it takes from Saint Seiya's Sanctuary arc, or primarily its 12 Zodiac Palaces segment, which is the third act of that arc. This isn't just as surface level as both being rescue arcs to save a damsel in distress, with the main antagonistic group's most elite members having similar numbers, but even finer details, such as both settings being reflective of the culture most ingrained in the series' identity, the main villain being a strong member of the group manipulating them with the help of a few traitors, each also having one of these elites being caught between family and duty, who confront the protagonist before the rescue, and the protagonist group gaining acceptance from the antagonistic group by the end. That's not to call Bleach a ripoff though, as it adds or deviates from Saint Seiya's inspiration to stand on its own, but it does allow for strong comparisons to be made, and show why, despite the rescue arc being one of the most common tropes within action shonen, these two are treated as the standard by many for their respective generations. The most simple aspect of a good rescue arc is presenting the investment of the main cast well in rescuing the one in need. For Bleach, Ichigo's is made very clear in how much his role as a protector for his family and need to make up for what happened to his mother has influenced his psychology, as well as the events surrounding Rukia having allowed for more clarity on who he is as a person. The same is true to lesser extents for Orihime, Chad, and Uryu, but by comparison, they are mainly there from Ichigo being the connecting factor, and Rukia being their friend with the stronger motivations of wise being for both Ganju's desire for revenge, and the varied personalities within the Gote 13, such as Renji's history with her, Byakuya's duty, or the intrigue surrounding the execution that presents varied views from the captains that we'll go into later. Perhaps the most intriguing of Ichigo's group in terms of their stake in the fight would be Urahara, with what's later revealed of the Hogyoku being a good way to deviate from a comparable Saint Seiya character like Mu with the Hellfin being built upon Urahara's own mistake in his attempt to hide his invention. As for Saint Seiya, though the motivations of the Bronze Saints seem more unified in wanting to save Athena, each has an equally strong personal stake to take on the Gold Saints or rescue Athena. Going back to what I said on Ichigo's protector status, something that tends to go overlooked on Seiya's psychology is how his sister being taken from him forced him into needing to become one who could protect those important to him, with the arc causing this savior complex in him to shine. There's then Hyoga having to move on from his mother as an emotional crutch, which sets up the ultimate goal of gaining both the cool mindset and ice manipulation to surpass Camus early on. Shiryu being rewarded for his sacrifices comes from the bonds with his loved ones. Shun probably has the weakest motivation going into it, in mainly wanting to protect others, but is arguably the one to grow the most as a character, in coming to terms with the need to eradicate those too evil to be reasoned with, and though not too dynamic in mainly wanting to protect his brothers, Ikki coming to remember his encounter with Shaka has him gain a greater desire to not be manipulated by others, and make up for his past transgressions when his actions with the Black Saints made him very much a small-scale, naive version of Saga. There's also the unifying aspect in the manga of all the Bronze Saints being blood-related, while detesting the actions of their father, and initially having been unwilling to help Saori, which shows the growth they went through after their battles with the Silver Saints, and the brief incident with Aeolia that helped unify them for this. For secondary characters, there's also Marin and Shaina, both being given clear reasons to aid Seiya, in particular Shaina's motivations for her adherence to tradition, eventually being broken by Cassius, and having her forced strong emotions for Seiya becoming more mature ones of camaraderie, give her one of the most underrated character arcs in the series. With that point of Shaina's character, another aspect of a rescue arc is what those in need are being rescued from beyond a life or death situation, by what the antagonist group represents, these being the Gote 13 for Bleach, and Sanctuary and its Gold Saints for Saint Seiya. Both represent a stagnant order, where traditions or preconceptions blind those within to the corruption going on, with change for the better only being possible if the protagonists succeed. I'll speak of how this affects certain characters in Bleach a bit later, but the main takeaway of how both excel in this area would be the balance each have between tradition's effectiveness and need for change. Though the Gotei 13 are what brought order to Soul Society and had transformed into a far more protectorial role than the warriors that founded it, and also been what stopped the inevitable Quincy invasion, being something for Squad Zero to shoulder entirely. Their merciless past transforming into draconic bureaucracy made them no more than puppets for Aizen, and ultimately incapable of countering Yuhabaha's return, if not for those who broke from the traditions of their predecessors, such as Ichigo's role in general, or Shunsui making the difficult decision later on to seek help from Aizen. Sanctuary, though a similar bastion against the forces of the other Olympians, had resigned itself to a perpetual cycle, in both the fate of its saints and Athena herself, with strict practices that were ultimately dehumanizing to many, or elements of discrimination still remaining in its ranks, only for Saori, Seiya, and the others to both reform certain rules of it, change preconceptions, and break one of the biggest cycles in the series, in part due to how this generation deviated from the past. On the subject of a character's motivations, a driving force behind these two arcs would be the varied motivations in the antagonist group. This is somewhere Bleach fully steps out of Saint Seiya's shadow, since whereas both have a mix of being willing to help the protagonist, those unsure of the truth, and traitors in the midst, the murder mystery of Aizen adds another layer of intrigue in the internal conflict of the organization, in few knowing who to trust. This brings us onto the twist of both primary antagonists. While the twist of Gemini Saga's split personalities is deduced far quicker and made clear before his face is even revealed, it has the proper pieces of foreshadowing through his contradictory actions, ties to the themes of his constellation, and adds to his complexity in serving as the duality of man pushed to two complete absolutes. Aizen's iconic reveal, while a good misdirect, doesn't stand as strong by the same metrics, when not having any foreshadowing for it, and the whole thing being revealed and explained after the fact. This does still work though, with the audience having as little to draw on as the characters, fits in Aizen's disappointment that there was no intellectual equal to see through his illusions, as much in-universe as outside for those who read it at the time, though his captain persona was a complete act. The conversation and misdirect he has with Renji in his introduction does establish a core aspect of his personality, which is the desire to question what others cannot, unlike his fellow captains that have grown stagnant in the unchanging nature of Soul Society, that had them fail to realize what Aizen was beyond the surface, with many such as Byakuya, Kenpachi, Mayuri, and Yamamoto fully growing thanks to the events shaking up the status quo. Back to Saga, though having less screen time overall than Aizen, he is instead characterized well and similarly represents the current institution through the different perceptions the other Gold Saints have on him. Some conflicted on if his dualistic tendencies are ones to follow, others adopting a might is right policy, and a few perceptive enough of his true nature to see the light shrouded by darkness. Their end goals are quite similar, in both wishing to strive towards overthrowing those far beyond their reach, with the damsel's end playing a part in their goal, and both having a good reason in why they simply can't achieve that goal immediately. Aizen needing the Sokyoku to be used to gain the Hogyoku until having gained Urahara's research, and Saga going out to finish off Saori himself, or order a Gold Saint to do so, would be something that would raise suspicion in the lengths he'd go to for something so trivial. Both overall are handled as different types of villains though, since whereas Aizen fully takes the antagonist role in the next arc, Saga and the institution he's formed are the personal goal for not just the Bronze Saints, but Athena to overcome, with the end of the arc having her fully come into and accept her role after his defeat. This is built built up well as, despite having Cosmo far greater than the Gold Saints, Saori was inexperienced enough that those of the might makes right mentality still sided with Saga, who earnestly believed the attitude fostered by previous incarnations of Athena would fail to protect Earth against the other gods. Athena's success in later arcs being in part from how Saga tested her. With that, it's worth moving on to the respective damsels, as well as the nature of both rescue missions, as both are placed in situations reliant on others, yet must also reflect on their true goals from it. This is more apparent in Rukia's case, with her guilt and trauma having her be very willing to sacrifice herself, and it taking the efforts of those such as Ichigo and Renji to have her realize the desire to live in order to uphold Cayenne's ideals. At the same time, she ends up more passive in the rescue arc than Saori, who despite spending the iconic third act unconscious for the most part, her ability to still aid the Bronze Saints, as well as endure the Golden Arrow, have her prove her worthiness and strength of character, through actions that make her being accepted by Sanctuary at the end a greater payoff. This even turns the rescue on its head, with it ultimately being Athena who helps save the Bronze Saints. Another aspect Saint Seiya does better is what can be called the sense of a ticking clock, as the clearest way to hammer in tension is to emphasize the race against time with a solidified time frame, with no way to extend it, and the visual of the zodiac clock adding an effective clarity. Though Rukia's execution does have a similar downward path, the changes to the execution date make it far less absolute, as does the aftermath of the execution being stopped. This does allow Bleach to have its own strengths through the constant changes to the date, adding more to the intrigue. But Saint Seiya still ends up having a more dire time limit, especially with the reveal at the literal 11th hour of there being more to saving Athena than merely reaching the goal. On the subject of their ending, though many will say Bleach deviates greatly in being set up for the next arc, rather than wrapping up the conflict with the primary antagonist, the aftermath of both are pretty similar in a loss of key figures weakening the manpower of both groups against future threats. In Saint Seiya's case, the Gold Saints being reduced to half made them vulnerable enough for Seidon's attacks in the next arc with being more deadly, if not for the Bronze Saints going on the offensive, and made them at more of a disadvantage against Hades than in prior generations. Whereas Gin and Tosen could have been great assets against the Sternritter and Royal Guards, such as Gin's Bankai being the hard counter to Askin or Bernida, as well as Tosen's Bankai being the potential counter to Barrow. On the subject of character abilities, a strong aspect to a rescue arc by its conclusion is a growth in power to showcase the characters being capable of not letting this misfortune become a cycle, and act as an encapsulation of the hero's journey. While both series have some broader premises be repeated in future arcs, they solidify this in Ichigo attaining his Bankai, and the Bronze Saints awakening the seventh sense. That wasn't something they could even imagine prior, aside from Shun, though it's not a complete level up for everyone, with Uryu losing his abilities until the Hueco Mundo arc, and the seventh sense being something the main five in Saint Seiya can only temporarily access, much as Ichigo's Reiatsu is incredibly inconsistent and unstable. Also, the Bronze Saints are in a critical condition after the consequences of this arc. On that, it's worth comparing how Ichigo and the Bronze Saints power up. Both achieve strength from their desires and emotions affecting their power, but with Ichigo's coming from psychological epiphanies, with what can be considered his subconscious self, coupled with later reveals clarifying why Ichigo is such a special case. The Bronze Saints are more united in their source of powering up, being the seventh sense, while a bit more vague and being more spiritual than psychological, with its roots in Zen Buddhist Satori, meaning sudden enlightenment. Its activation comes from similar epiphanies or character growth that fits with the microscopic, internal nature of Cosmos, such as Seiya remembering Marin's teachings to counter Aldebaran, Shiryu embracing Shunrei's feelings for him, having him overcome Death Mask, Hyoga honoring the sacrifice Shun went through to save him to overpower Milo, or Shun having already awakened to it earlier, having him learn to not fear defeating his foes. One thing Saint Seiya does better here, for those wishing to see more characters have equal shine, is this system allowing for each of them to be on the same level of relevance in both their power and victories, whereas the Ryoka in Bleach only have Ichigo, Uryu, and Yoruichi, who's kind of an unfair inclusion, getting the honor of defeating the captain. And while I prefer there's a good reason, not everyone can jump to being a powerhouse, it does leave those such as Chad sidelined. As soon as Shunsui showed him, there's limits to how much of a Chad he is. Meanwhile, despite the plot going out of its way to hype up Seiya, he arguably ends up less impressive in what he accomplished with his own Cosmo than Shiryu, Hyoga, or Ikki, with it being more so the efforts of his peers paving the way for him by the end. This is also helped by the minimal difference in power between each of the Gold Saints. That has the story provide a good reason as to why they can't oppose each other, compared to the difference between some captains, which while understandable, we're not all of the same generation, makes later uses of the term captain class more hollow than Ulquiorra's chest. This talk of powers also brings up how both the captains and Gold Saints have their powers say much about their characters, whereas the seated officers of Soul Society and the Silver Saints presented unique abilities. The former didn't delve heavily into how much of a visual display of self as Zanpakuto could be, while the latter mainly had their powers be centered around their constellation gimmick. It's with the high ranked of both organizations that we see the power system reflect their personalities. In Bleach, this is mainly from the Zanpakuto being a window to the soul, allowing for much to be examined from one's Shikai or Bankai, such as Torsen's Enma Korogi, making his opponent suffer while keeping it hidden from the outside world, showing there's more malicious aspects to his view of justice before the reveal of his allegiance, or Mayuri's Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo, that would be a guardian deity of children, foreshadowing his care for Nemu being deeper than he tells himself. Similarly, many of the Gold Saints have techniques not directly tied to their lore or constellations, such as Gemini Saga's Another Dimension and Galaxian Explosion, highlighting his desire to either banish or destroy all that stands against him, that include his opposing personality. Capricorn Shura's Excalibur, embodying the importance he places on individual strength and a sense of glory, as we see with how he both toys with Shiryu and then saves him after respecting his strength, or Pisce Aphrodite's rose abilities, rather than any fish techniques, other than technically Piranhan Rose. Having the divide between appearance and personality make him the fitting prelude to confronting Saga, as well as embodies the dual symbolism of Pisces in a more subtle manner. With that long comparison out of the way, both arcs do an excellent job standing out amongst the long history of rescue arcs in Shonen. I'd still probably cite the Sanctuary arc as the better one, but Soul Society, having its own share of advantages and unique manner of handling itself, has it serve as a good example of adding its own identity to the inspiration it took. As for the inevitable video on the Arrancar conflict, it will be a bit more of a straightforward analysis rather than a full comparison on what you'll just have to see. So subscribe, share it around, and see the next video.